So CEOs under pressure, global tariffs threaten to raise costs, squeeze profit margins, and ultimately boost inflation. Now joining us for a read on leadership and sentiment is Kevin Kajiwara, co-president of political risk advisory at Teneo. Kevin advises Fortune 100 CEOs and significant institutional investors on geopolitical and policy risk. You also probably haven't slept in a really long time based on these markets.
Alex, I haven't slept in 3 months now.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
Right, yeah.
So I'm a CEO and I'm getting ready to release earnings, and I'm calling you and I'm saying, what do I tell investors about the outlook for my earnings? What are you saying?
Well, you can imagine that Teneo is receiving a lot of incoming on this very point. Of course, the issue is how you're dealing with these. Also, how you're going to mitigate against them going forward. No matter how well you did in the last quarter, everything is about now how well you're positioned for the future. The challenge, of course, is that everybody's in a slightly different boat. I mean, John was just talking about some of his portfolio as an example, but the reality of it is what your international profile looks like, what your supply chain looks like, what your financial position and your wherewithal to be able to absorb some of the shock. We saw this news from Stellantis earlier today, that they were going to inoculate some of their supply chain to a certain degree. So it's kind of all over the place, and has to be handled really on a bespoke basis, to be honest.
Well, I am curious about how they're going to handle the public messaging, particularly when it comes to their consumers, basically the people who are buying the end products. Because if we do see a spike in prices, we kind of know how this plays. It's not necessarily the blame is not necessarily always going to go to the White House. Some people are going to look at the companies and complain that, oh, you're gouging us or some other thing. So what's the approach they need to take with that in managing their own costs and managing the possibility they may not have a choice but to raise prices?
Well, yeah, you've named it, Romaine, right? I mean, how that is going to be read is going to be somewhat determined by how much pricing flexibility the company is perceived to have, but also the product that they sell and what the elasticity of demand is in the wake of that. I also think that CEOs need to be highly cognizant as well of how that message is received elsewhere. I mean, the CEO is going to say what they are going to say. That's going to be received by all the various stakeholders in very different ways, right? Whether it's your shareholder, your customer, your employees, your regulator, the White House, Beijing, Brussels. Everybody's going to hear through the lens with, the way that they listen to it. And, you've got kind of one opportunity to thread that needle, which is why it's really critical to calibrate that.
This may be a question you can't answer, but earnings season is coming up, as Alex just alluded to. Is there sort of advice to these CEOs to maybe not say anything at all, or at least not to say anything beyond the most basic and necessary thing that you need to come across on that conference call or on their whatever interviews they're doing in the media?
I think, again, it's case-by-case basis. As we have already seen just today, really for the first time since the news came out last week, certain CEOs really starting in the financial sector, but going elsewhere as well, starting to break out a little bit here and be a little bit more candid on what they think, the net impact is going to be on the economy, on the consumer, on earnings, and and the challenge that the Fed is going to have going forward.
We recently, Bloomberg published an article about how Apple might be moving some of their iPhone production to India, or really focus on that. Are your companies aggressively thinking about how to reshape their supply chain? And if so, how?
I think they're thinking about anything that they possibly can here up at the moment. But I think also they've got to consider, again, the volatility with which policymaking is currently being made and whether they're going to start to get some clarity on, where things are going to go and if there are going to be any off-ramps to the current policy on tariffs. As an example, right? I mean, if you're thinking about building a new factory somewhere, factories get depreciated out over 20 years. What happens if the tariff regime changes significantly over 20 years, right? After the first round of Trump tariffs in the first administration that were then compounded, doubled down on, and continued by the Biden administration, you saw a lot of companies attempt to, say, decouple, as an example, from or de-risk from China and move to Vietnam. Look how hard Vietnam was hit with tariffs last week. That would lead you to consider maybe that's not the place to be. And then Vietnam says they want to cut tariffs to zero and wants to negotiate with the White House. That would stay your hand yet again. So the point is that change is expensive. It takes time.
Right.
And you can't undo these decisions.
So when does a pause in, say, spend become a non-existent spend? When you just not do anything?
Well, I mean, I think that's more or less what we're, more or less what we're seeing right now. And again, depending on, where you are, how sensitive the nature of your business is, how much substitutability there is in the marketplace, et cetera, is going to be determinative of how much flexibility you've got.
Do corporate executives, particularly the CEOs, do they feel like they have anyone in Washington who will listen to them?
I think they feel that they've got plenty of people in Washington who will listen to them. I think
anyone who's actually in a position to actually make real decisions.
I think that's the big question, right? And certainly, I think what they're still adjusting to is whether all of the assumptions that they made about the president and his reaction function to, say, the market, as an example, are the same as they expected coming out of the first administration.
Yeah.
But I do think that they are, look, they're definitely getting a hearing, not only in the White House but in Congress, regulators, and the like.
I bring that up. I had a phone call on Saturday with the CEO of a major corporation. He talked about the speed of which all this came, and he was drawing parallels to the first Trump administration, how they went through kind of more standard review processes, putting things in the Federal Register, and that from the time that Trump started talking about tariffs this was on China, to the time that they were actually implemented, was like 18 months. It was a long time. This has basically been a 10.5, 11-week process, more or less, assuming you just peg it to his inauguration. So they're saying that we don't even have time to go down to Washington and lobby for what we want. Or if we do, we basically got 48 hours to make our case, and that's it.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, Romaine. And not only that, it is entirely possible that a new event that might not even be related to the tariffs, something in Russia, Ukraine, something in the South China Sea, something in the Middle East, any number of events could distract the White House, the markets, and companies alike. We know, as an example, that we've got must-pass legislation that is continuing to compound, and the clock is ticking.
All right, Kevin, got to leave it there. Kevin Kajiwara, a co-president political risk advisory at Teneo.